Greetings all and welcome to Lucas Brews. In today's video I'll be doing a double build of the Revell 1/72 scale F4U-4 Corsair. For these two kits I'll be doing them up as 211 and 205 from VF32 in honour of Jesse Brown and Tom Hudner. I'll be adding some 3D printed cockpits and weaponry to these aircraft, as well as doing some figure painting and trying out some custom decals from Laser Shark Designs. So without further ado, let's have a build of these two Corsairs. To begin with, I washed all of these sprues in some warm soapy water, along with the resin cockpit I'd designed and 3D printed, which had previously been washed in alcohol and cured off screen. I cut out the fuselage from the sprues and set those aside, as the cockpit in this build would entirely be made from my resin parts. These needed to be cut off their supports from printing, which I did using my side cutters. My cockpit design consisted of a floor along with a rear bulkhead, main instrument panel, two sidewalls, and some smaller parts for some extra detail. The kit's original plastic guidelines for its cockpit had to be removed using a knife and file, and once I'd sanded the edges of the resin rear bulkhead down, I glued it with some Deluxe Materials Rocket Odorless CA glue to the cockpit floor. I had to trim a tiny bit off the rear edges of the floor to make a perfect fit, and once that was done, I then used some blue tack to stick the other cockpit parts to a cocktail stick for painting. Normally for models, I would prime the interior first, but for this build, I decided to try skipping this step to save a bit of time, and instead mixed up 3 drops of Vallejo Acrylic Flow Improver with 5 drops of Vallejo Model Air 71010 US Interior Green. While this paint sprayed on pretty well onto the plastic parts, it didn't stick so well to the resin ones, and despite trying to build it up slowly in layers, I ended up applying it too thick and found that it pooled in some areas, which I'd have to later touch up. There was also a lot less depth since I was only spraying onto white plastic, so I'll definitely keep using my gloss black primer on cockpits in future builds. For the detail work, I decided to try using a lighter colour than straight black in the form of AK Interactive 7021 Dunkel Grau. This acrylic paint was carefully thinned with a bit of water and brush painted onto the panels, joystick grip, and the raised details which would have been black on the actual aircraft. I used a brush and the interior green to touch up some of the resin parts where the interior green hadn't stuck, though in some spots I had to apply a few coats as the airbrush layer seemed to peel away in a few spots since it didn't stick very well to the resin. For the instrument dials and fuse switches, I used Vallejo Model Color Flat Black so they would stand out from the dark grey panels. This was followed by some more detail painting using Vallejo Vermilion Red, Vallejo Flat Yellow, and Vallejo Flat White, which was also dry brushed onto some of the cockpit surface details to highlight them, and to pick out the raised details I'd designed into the gauges. Further details were then painted with some Model Air RLM01 silver, such as the switches and the gun sight, and then I painted the joystick cover, the oxygen control valve on the floor with flat black, and the headrest with Dunkel Grau. I removed the parts from the cocktail stick and did a quick test fit of the cockpit, and when I was satisfied everything fitted perfect as designed, I used some Vallejo gloss varnish to dab onto the gauges to give them a behind glass effect, did some final dry brushing with the white on the sidewalls, and then glued the sidewalls to the cockpit floor with the Deluxe Materials Odorless CA glue, followed by the instrument panel. With everything in place, I did a test fit of the cockpit parts and the fuselage, and found that everything fitted pretty decently. Some additional resin details for the oxygen and canopy handle were glued to the sidewalls, and then they received a coat of the interior green. Once dried, flat black was then used to pick out the details, along with some vermilion red, and for the oxygen lines a bit of olive grey. I did some final touch-ups in the cockpit, followed by some dry brushing of the headrest with some Vallejo Flat White, and then I added some metal chipping onto the seat and cockpit floor using Vallejo Model Air Aluminium. I used a dry brushing technique to build it up carefully, though I would probably next time do this before assembling the cockpit to make it a bit easier to add some scratches on the floor. Some Tamiya enamel black panel scent was then applied over all of the interior parts to highlight their details, and once it had been applied, I then used a brush dipped in some enamel thinners to remove the excess panel liner and help it flow mainly into the recessed details to give them a dirty, grimy appearance in places, as well as to help show off the recessed details. The cockpits were then glued to the right fuselage halves, and after taking some photos, I then glued the two fuselage halves together using Revell Contactor Professional on the plastic parts, and some of the Rocket Odorless CA glue on the resin ones. To my delight, these parts all fitted very well. Some Tamiya masking tape was wrapped tightly around the fuselage halves to hold them together while they bonded, and then I ran some Tamiya extra thin cement along the seam lines to help fill them in and strengthen the bond between these parts. I sat them aside to dry, and in the meantime cut out the wings along with the horizontal stabilizers and tail parts, and began to clean these parts up of any flash and excess sprue. The top wing halves were then glued to the lower wing halves, clamped into place with some bulldog clips, and once again I ran some Tamiya extra thin into the seams between these parts. The radiator pieces were then glued into place, and they fitted okay, but there was a subtle gap. The engine cowling, 2 rows of cylinders, gearbox and propeller parts were the next to be removed from the sprue, and I found that the cylinders were a particular pain as the sprue attachments were very thick and close to the cylinder heads, making them very hard to remove. The top fuselage part also was cut out and had its glare shield removed so that it would fit with the new 3D printed part. As you'll see later on, this part is actually the wrong shape for a later model Corsair, and appears to be a part recycled from the Revell -1 kit. Initially, I glued the engine cowling parts together, but after assembling the engine and gearbox and trying to get them to fit inside, I found I would have to pull apart the cowling to make them fit during assembly, so in the meantime I took the cowling apart except for the front and top part of it, and glued the engine parts and exhausts to the bulkhead, which had the cow flaps moulded shut. The fuselage and wings had had a few hours to bond by now, so I removed all of the clamps and masking tape and glued them together. The fit was pretty good for the wings and fuselage, so I then added the rudder and horizontal stabilizers. I ran some Tamiya extra thin along some of the gaps before then adding the wingtip parts to the wings, and I found that these parts didn't fit so well, which was pretty annoying, especially on the underside. Ironically, this Corsair is the only one I've seen in 1/72nd scale so far that doesn't have a foothole in the flap, which is accurate for the early versions of the Corsair, but all later ones would have had it. I ended up borrowing the Tamiya Corsair's flap and used it as a template to mark out the footsteps with a needle, and then I cut away the footwell, sanded the edges, and while doing this also removed the early antenna point on the top of the tail. I then made the edge of the footwell by gluing a very small piece of plastic into place to make the edge of the flap, and although this was a little bit crude, I thought I did a pretty good job adding the footwells without too much fuss. Further improvements included chopping the exhausts, not for noise, but rather making them a more accurate size, and I did attempt to scribe the footwells on the fuselage side, but didn't really have a good template, so I ended up later filling over my attempts with putty and sanding them smooth. The upper fuselage part was then added to the Corsairs, but I found on one of them that a lot of pressure was needed at the front of the fuselage halves to get a tight fit. Learning from my experience with the cockpit, I decided to prime the engine and cowling parts before painting them this time, so I used my typical choice of Vallejo Gloss Plaque Primer, thinned down with some acrylic flow improver. Once this was applied, I let the primer cure for a couple of hours, and returned to the fuselage, doing a lot of sanding along the seam lines to start to soften them up. Initially, I used a metal file for the sanding, and then gradually transitioned to a softer nail file, and would later do more filling with a bit of putty. The canopies included in this kit were a little bit mediocre, so I decided to turn one of them into a mould by filling it with milliput and vacuforming my own set. My first attempts were a bit rough, especially around the edges, since I didn't have them outlined very precisely, and they didn't fit very well as a result. But I did learn from my Italeri Mustang build and procure myself a smaller pair of scissors, which made it a lot easier to cut them out. I would later on redo the canopies and get a much better result. I decided though to keep the first attempt at a front windshield in place and use it as a template to help me fill in the incorrect gap in the front fuselage part with some Vallejo water-based putty. The putty was also applied over any large gaps in all of the seam lines quite heavily, and once it had been added, I then wiped away most of the excess with a damp finger so that it would build up in only the larger gaps. By now the engine parts were ready for some painting, so I mixed up 4 parts of Vallejo acrylic flow improver with 4 drops of Vallejo Model A US Navy Glossy Sea Blue and painted the inside of the engine cowlings. I then used a similar ratio of flow improver to paint with some Vallejo Model Air Aluminium Silver to paint the engines. Since acrylic paints dry very quickly, by the time I'd cleaned up my airbrush, I could then paint the gearbox on the engine with some Ocean Grey, the rear of the engine bulkhead and a few touch-ups on the cowling with some USN Gloss Sea Blue, and finally I picked out some of the wiring and engine details with some model colour flat black. A second coat of these colours was applied, and then I finally glued the engine to the top part of the cowling and added the lower part. These parts didn't fit too well though, and required a lot of force to then fit to the fuselage, which unfortunately caused me to break one of the propeller attachment points on one of the Corsairs. Tamiya Extra Thin was applied, followed by a fair bit of Vallejo water-based putty to then try and fill in the gaps around these engine parts. I let all of the putty dry for around about 12 hours, and then using some 2000 grit sandpaper, I sanded away any remaining putty and seam lines until I had a smooth finish and the gaps were largely gone. I probably should have applied some putty around the wing areas and especially the radiators, but on the whole I was pretty happy with the sanding and filling, given that it's an area I've been wanting to improve with my kit building, and these were pretty gappy kits. The landing gear parts and drop tanks were then cut out and sanded of their various imperfections, and the landing gear doors had to be cut in half to be in the open position, which is very fiddly to do, and I broke several of the fine hinge points which come moulded to these parts. The front part of the wings with the 350 cal machine guns were then glued to each wing, and then I attached the pylons for the fuel tank or bombs and the tail wheel. The main landing gear was very fiddly and annoying to assemble, and some of the parts are fragile and very easy to break off from the way they're attached to the sprue, but once I figured out one of them, the rest of the landing gear and its various doors were reasonably easy to assemble, though the tail wheel doors were especially awkward to add. The final part I added to the landing gear was the main wheels, which were glued to the struts, and then I left the aircraft aside to dry as the landing gear was very fragile. While I let the gear harden, I assembled the fuel tanks, which had some rather large gaps, and one set of bombs, as unfortunately the second Corsairs were missing part of the stabilizing fin. By now I was pretty much ready to prime the aircraft, so the last thing I did was repair some of the panel lines which had been lost during sanding by using some SMS clear scribing tape and my Tamiya scribing tool to rescore them. I originally planned to paint the fuel tanks at the same time, but they required a fair bit of filling, so I decided to fill them with putty and leave them aside to deal with later. To prepare the Corsairs for priming, I then wiped off any dirt and grease using a microfiber cloth, and after filling the engine and cockpit over with blue tack to mask them off and attaching the propeller to a cocktail stick, I mixed up 20 drops of Vallejo acrylic flow improver with 18 drops of Vallejo gloss black primer, and began to spray this on the underside of the first Corsair, building it up gradually in layers until eventually the whole underside was a reasonably uniform gloss black finish. I then sat the first Corsair aside while the primer became touch dry, and repeated this process on the second Corsair, and then primed the propellers. I had to mix up some more of the primer before I then painted the upper surface of the first Corsair in much the same fashion, and once again I then repeated this step on the second Corsair, and then sat them both aside for at least 12 hours to let the primer cure before moving on to painting. The first paint I would apply would be for the white unit markings on the top of both Corsairs' tails. I first masked the edges of the bands off with Tamiya masking tape to reduce any overspray. Then I mixed 3 drops of Vallejo acrylic flow improver with 3 drops of Vallejo Model Air Insignia flat white, and sprayed this onto the top parts of the tails, building it up gradually. Once the white had then had a few hours to dry and cure, I then removed the masking tape from below it and used it to mask off the white, and mixed up 10 drops of acrylic flow improver, a drop of Vallejo paint retardant to prevent tip drying, and 10 drops of Model Air US Navy Glossy Sea Blue. Once mixed up, I then began to paint the underside of the first Corsair, building the paint up gradually in many passes until the underside was a uniform glossy sea blue. Spraying the glossy sea blue onto black primer is a bit of a challenge since both colours are so dark, though I was very reluctant to use a white primer, as in most photos I've seen the glossy sea blue can be so dark it almost appears black. It also seems to have a bluish but sometimes green tone depending on the photo, and the Vallejo paint seemed to capture this quite well depending on the lighting. Once the first Corsair was painted, I then sat it aside and painted the second Corsair's underside. By the time the second Corsair had been painted, the first Corsair was touch dry underneath, so I mixed up some more paint, turned over the first aircraft, and sprayed the top side in the same manner, once again repeating this process on the second Corsair when the first one was done. To create some subtle variation and fading in some spots, I then mixed up 7 drops of flow improver with 5 drops of glossy sea blue and 2 drops of faded PRU blue to create a lighter bluish colour. This was then sprayed onto the fabric areas and control surfaces, along with the middle of several panels on the upper surface of the wings, and along the fuselage sides, focusing the paint more heavily on the upper surface. This was a bit too subtle and I wanted a more saturated colour rather than more of a blue, so I mixed up 8 drops of flow improver with 6 drops of sea blue and this time 2 drops of insignia white. This produced a much stronger effect that I was happy with, so I applied this in the same spots like the fabric surfaces as well as on the upper fuselage, especially behind the engine area. The effect on both Corsairs ended up very strong, so to soften this I blended it in with another coat of the glossy sea blue. And with the post shading done and softened, I then removed the masking on the white markings and gave the paint a few more hours to cure, and in the meantime applied several coats of Vallejo Model Colour Flat Black onto the propeller and Model Air Insignia White onto the spinner using a brush. I built these colours up gradually in several layers, keeping the paint nice and thin by using some water. The tyres on the Corsair were also painted with the Model Colour Flat Black, and for the landing gear struts and wheel hubs, I decided to go with Vallejo Model Colour 70997 Silver. This was a bit more of a dull bare metal silver that was less shiny than the Model Air silvers I would have previously used. I painted around about 2 coats carefully onto the wheel hubs and the strut for the main wheels and tail wheel based on reference photos. With the final coat of black done on the propellers, I then painted the tips of the blades with some Vallejo Model Colour Pink to serve as a base coat for the yellow, and gave the wheels some more touch-ups while the pink dried. Vallejo Model Colour Flat Yellow was then applied in just 2 coats, and as you can see, the pink really makes the yellow pop and a lot easier to apply. With most of the painting done, I was almost ready to move on to the decals, but first I sprayed both Corsairs and their propellers with some Vallejo gloss varnish, thinned to a ratio of 1 drop of flow improver for 1 drop of varnish. This would not only protect the water-based paints when applying decals and handling the model, but also provide a glossy surface for the decals to prevent any silvering. I gave the varnish 12 hours to fully cure before I then started preparing the decals. For the markings, I decided to use GIMP and some downloaded fonts and images to make my own markings for White 205 and 211. 205 is the aircraft from VF32 that Tom Hudner ditched, and 211 is an aircraft Jesse Brown is known to have flown, and I believe the one that he also ditched as well. Once designed, I then had them printed by Michael from Laser Shark Designs, and I was really happy with the quality that he achieved with them. They aren't pre-cut like off-the-shelf kit decals are, so they had to be individually cut out, and I really should have done a neater job of this and tried to have as little clear film on each decal as possible, but they still worked out okay. The only kit decals I would end up using would be the Hamilton standard logos for the propellers, the anti-skid marks on the wings, and the fuel info on the upper fuselages. The decals from Laser Shark were easy to apply, and even when I accidentally folded them up a little bit, they didn't disintegrate, so they are much better than anything Mr. Craft has come up with. They are slightly transparent, so I probably should have done an extra white decal to use as a backing, since I was applying them onto a very dark surface, which meant that the red was a little bit saturated on the star and bar. Overall though, I was still really impressed by them, and would definitely recommend Laser Shark decals if you have a need for custom markings that you're happy to design yourself. Once applied, I gave all of the decals the usual treatment of Vallejo decal softener and Tamiya decal adhesive to help them sink into the surface details of the model, and after giving the decals 12 hours to set, I did another coat of glossy varnish to protect the decals, and blend everything together with the gloss finish that the post-war Corsairs would have had. I once again let everything cure for 12 hours, and then I got out some matte varnish and used a brush to apply this onto the propeller blades, tail wheel, and the main landing gear. This would give them a more accurate matte dull finish, unlike the glossy finish of the paint. 2 coats of varnish were applied, thinned down with water for a smooth finish. With all of the airbrushing done, I removed the blue tack from the engine and cockpit areas. For 205, I attempted drilling out a hole since the pin had broken earlier for fitting the propeller, but I didn't want to damage the engine, so ended up leaving it for the moment. I made a second attempt at the vacuform canopies, which I'd cut out off camera, and then painted the frames of with 2 coats of interior green to match the cockpit and create the framework colour for the inside of the canopy. Once the interior green had dried, I then applied 2 coats of the USN Glossy Sea Blue for the exterior colour. Both of these colours were also used to touch up the areas where the masking had been around the cockpit. Since I'd used acrylic paints for the canopies, I could then use a cocktail stick to very gently scratch away any mistakes and neaten up the edges of the canopy frames before then gluing the front windshield for both Corsairs to their fuselage. For this I used some Deluxe Materials Rocket Odorless CA glue, since this glue acts pretty fast and doesn't fog up the clear parts. Unfortunately, the windscreens fitted quite poorly, and while part of this is how the kit is designed and is somewhat present with the kit's original canopy, the other seems to be still me getting the hang of the vacuforming and making moulds. I'd basically taken the kit's original canopies to use as a mould and filled them up with milliput, but these moulds needed the edges to be trimmed down to make the edge of the canopy frames more defined to make it easier cutting them out. With all the varnish cured, I began the weathering process, first with some metal chipping. I initially used some Vallejo Model Air aluminium and used a fine brush to stipple on chipping and metal scratches. I make sure to dab most of the excess paint off the brush onto some paper towel so it's almost dry when I apply it onto the model, which helps ensure any scratches have sharp edges and the paint will not run out of control. I focus the metal chipping on the leading edges of the propeller blades, around the engine access panels, any hatches, the canopy sides, the tailhook, leading edge of the wing, and along the panel lines and footholds in the areas where pilots and mechanics would walk on, which regularly show a lot of metal chipping in reference photos. While the first layer of chipping dries, I painted the exhausts a base coat of Vallejo Model Color Gold, and then applied the second layer of chipping with some Model Air US Interior Green, which I applied very lightly around the wing area and canopy. This recreates the paint that is chipped away, revealing some of the primer colour, which can be seen on some Corsairs, though with this effect less is often more. With the third and final layer of chipping dried, I then mixed up some Vallejo Model Air Insignia White with some USN Glossy Sea Blue, and used the same dry brushing technique to create more superficial and lighter areas of worn paint and scratches. This also helps cover some of the primer and metal chipping, giving a layered effect and softening everything to a more subtle result. I gave the chipping a few minutes to dry, which is usually sufficient for acrylic paints, before moving on to applying a Tamiya enamel black panel wash. This was applied over the entire model to highlight the recessed details, as well as to add a subtle griminess to the panel lines, and especially on the engine and landing gear. I've seen some people use a grey or even a white wash on darker models like this, but I decided to stick with black as it seemed more realistic to me. Once applied, I then wiped away the excess enamel wash using some X20 Tamiya enamel thinners and a cotton bud. I also streaked the enamel wash and in some areas dabbed it, especially under the engine, for some subtle oil grime. The enamel wash seemed to really tone down the metal chipping to the point where I considered actually redoing it to make it stronger, but in the end I decided to keep it more subtle for a bit of a change. For some gun smoke and exhaust stains, I went with my current preferred method of using AK Interactive's Uptilong 502 oil paints, this time getting some white, flat earth, engine grime and black, and squeezing a bit of these colours onto some cardboard, and then letting some of the oil seep out of the paints for a few hours. They were then reactivated with some AK Interactive odorless thinners, and first of all I used black to brush on some gun smoke on the machine gun barrels and ejection ports, along with a base for the exhaust stains by dabbing them onto the exhausts and streaking them backwards, and a little bit on the wheel hubs to add some grime. Corsair exhaust stains seem to vary a lot in colours and intensity, and from my knowledge a lot of that is to do with the kind of missions they were flying. Generally, lighter colours with exhaust stains are the result of leaning the mixture to improve range and economy, and this seems to be what most Korean War Corsairs show in photos, which would make sense as they were flying longer, closer air support missions, or circling over areas for longer periods looking for targets, rather than dogfighting with a richer mixture of fuel and air for maximum performance. For a lighter brownish colour amongst the exhausts, I streaked in a little bit of the flat earth, and then I applied a lot more of the white. Some lighter stains and grime were also dabbed onto the underside of the Corsair's cowlings with the engine grime colour, and then I dipped a brush in some of the odorless thinners and started to streak the oil paints back to tone them down and also add a streaking effect. For the gun smoke I used a finer brush and the same technique to soften the edges and to streak back the gun stains. Since oil paints require a long time to dry, I set the models aside and worked on sanding the two drop tanks and armaments for each aircraft. The putty and seam lines on the drop tanks were sanded down to a smooth finish using 2000 grit sandpaper, and then I attached them along with some 10-inch HVAR rockets I'd 3D printed onto some balsa wood strips to use as handles. I wiped any dust from sanding off the drop tanks using a microfiber cloth, and then primed both the tanks and rockets with some Vallejo gloss black primer in several passes until they had a uniform gloss black finish. I gave the primer 12 hours to fully cure, before then spraying the drop tanks with Vallejo Model Air USN Glossy Sea Blue, while the rockets were sprayed with Vallejo Model Air Light Gull Grey. The airbrushed acrylics dry really quickly, so by the time I'd cleaned up and put away my airbrush, I could then move on to painting the details on the rockets. First with some Vallejo Model Colour US Olive Drab for the tips, and then with some USN Glossy Sea Blue for the mounting points, Vallejo Model Colour Flat Black for the firing mechanism, and finally some Vallejo Model Air Aluminium for the very tips of the rockets, based on reference photos. The drop tanks and rockets were set aside, and I cut out some of the new canopies I vacuformed following modifications to my mould, so I had clearer edges to follow when trimming them out. As you can see, my later attempts at the vacuform canopies are much less distorted and clearer compared to the kit's included clear parts, though neither the vacuform or out-of-the-box canopies fit very well to the model, due to them being the later type of flat windscreen used on the Dash 4, but the kit's fuselage is still for the earlier Dash 1 with the rounded windscreen. The canopies were painted with 2 coats of interior green for the inside colour, and then with 2 coats of USN Glossy Sea Blue for their exterior. In between these coats, I slotted the drop tanks onto their racks. Two of the drop tanks fitted really snugly to the racks, but the others required a bit of blue tack so that I could put them on or take them off if I wanted. The rockets were removed from the balsa and then glued to the underside of the wings using some rocket odorless CA glue, and I tried to get them as straight as I possibly could. They went on pretty easy, and I think they make the Corsairs look a lot meaner. Once the canopies had been painted, I then used a cocktail stick to gently scratch away any mistakes or excess paint from them, and then I cut out the kit's included pitot tubes and antennas. Unfortunately, one of the pitot tubes snapped in half and was too fragile to fix, so for now one of my Corsair's pitot tubes is shorter, but I'll probably 3D print a new one at some point in the future. The antennas and tubes were glued to the model, and then I did some touch-ups on the rockets and picked out the lights, pitot tubes, and 3D printed cockpit's mirrors with some Vallejo Model Air RLM01 silver. There are 3 recessed dots on the underside of each wingtip, which I believe are supposed to be the recognition lights, but they seem to be too far outboard for an F4U-4, and they should only be on the right side of the aircraft. For the left side, I only painted one of them to represent the landing light, which would be in a similar position. The silver was left to dry, and in the meantime I added the antenna wires with some AK Interactive mega thin rigging wire and some super glue. The rigging wire was glued first to the tail and then stretched the antenna after the cockpit, and once it was in place, the excess was cut off and I added the smaller line that runs from the fuselage to the main wire. This was a pretty easy process, and I even managed to add the rigging without any swearing, which has to be a first. For the mirrors, I used rocket odorless CA glue to glue them to the inside of the canopy, since this glue doesn't fog up clear plastic, and I was really happy with the results. Finally, I painted the left nav light and top recognition light with some Tamiya clear red, the right nav light and the middle recognition light with clear green, and the bottom recognition light was painted with some AK Interactive clear orange. And with that, the Corsairs were completed, but it felt like something was missing. For this build, I decided to also make some pilots to represent Tom Hudner and Jesse Brown, so after several weeks that delayed this video, I managed to design, prototype, then redesign, and finally print out a set of figures that I was happy with that I'll also be selling on my Cults page. I printed them out, cleaned them up in alcohol, removed their supports, cured them, and then washed them again in some warm soapy water off camera, and after some final cleanups, I glued all of the figures to some balsa as I'd done with the rockets. They were then primed with several coats of Vallejo gloss black primer to provide a surface for the paint to stick to. The black is also great for shading, as I could then spray some Vallejo Model Air Insignia white from above the models to create some shading for their base coats, which is a technique I've seen many other much more experienced and professional figure painters use. Once the highlights had dried, I then painted Tom's face, initially using a coat of Vallejo Model Color Flat Flesh, which was thinned down heavily with water. While that dried, I painted Jesse's skin a base of Model Color German Camouflage Pale Brown, once again very thin and carefully brushed on. I decided to go with the film as a reference for costume design and colours, so I painted Tom Hudner's jumpsuit with AK Interactive's Australian Camouflage Brown, which I thought produced a really lovely tan colour for his flight suit. Jesse tends to sport the earlier green jumpsuit, so for this I used Vallejo Model Color Olive Grey in much the same fashion. For the figure's jackets, I painted them with a base coat of Vallejo Model Color Chocolate Brown, and initially I left their jackets unpainted at the back before I realised that their life jackets don't actually fully cover it. For the second layer on Tom's skin, I used some dark flesh, applied with a bit more water so that it would sink more into the recesses of his face as it's a darker colour, while I did the same thing with chocolate brown for Jesse's skin. For the survival vests, I used my trick of painting anything I want yellow, first with a light pink, and once the pink had dried, I then painted them with Model Color Flat Yellow in 2 coats. I applied a second coat of paint on their flight suits, followed by another coat of chocolate brown for their jackets, which also helped to neaten up any yellow from the life vests and fully paint their backs. I couldn't find very clear photos of their gloves, but in the end I went with AK Interactive Dunkel Grau for a dark, almost black kind of leather colour. All figures are wearing gloves, except for one of Tom's poses where he's also holding on to them. Tom's skin was still a bit too transparent, so I painted another coat of flat flesh, and for their shoes and parachutes, I went with some Vallejo model colour English uniform. This produced a nice lighter, almost khaki reddish brown colour, which I think looked quite good. Some of the jackets were not fully yellow, so I ended up doing a third and final coat to make them a bit more solid, and with the clothing and skin done, I started picking out the finer details, such as their helmets with Vallejo model colour flat white, and then did another coat of chocolate brown on their jackets, and English uniform on their shoes and parachutes. For their masks, I went with model colour Yellow Olivia, which is a nice darker green, and for their oxygen lines, I went with AK Interactive Russian 3BO Green, which is an even darker and slightly more grey green. The soles of their shoes were then picked out with Dunkel Grau, and while that dried, I did another coat of white on their helmets, and then neatened their shoes up with some of the English uniform brown. This colour was also used as the base for Tom's hair. The goggles on the helmets were then picked out with Vallejo model colour flat black very carefully using a fine brush. Initially, I painted the entire goggle with black, including the clear section. A third and final coat was applied onto their flying suits, and by that stage their goggles had dried, so I mixed some white with water to heavily dilute the paint, and then dabbed it onto the centre of each figure goggles, and let the capillary motion flow the paint into the recesses. This then left the black frames of the goggles visible since they're raised, and I repeated this process using some skin colour for one of the figures who has the goggles down. For a final highlight on Tom's skin before using some washes, I used model colour light flesh to dry brush his nose, cheeks and forehead, and once all of the paint was dry, I applied a black enamel wash over all of the figures, which would darken the recessed details on them, adding some shading. After the wash was applied, I used a cotton bud dipped in enamel thinners to gently dab away the excess wash from the raised areas, making the figures a lot less dark and further helping the wash to flow into just the gaps. The black wash looked really good on their clothing, but for human skin, I tend to prefer a brown wash to make the flesh look a little bit lighter and more living. So I applied a brown wash onto each figure's face, and then used a brush dipped in enamel thinners to once again remove the excess. I let the enamel wash dry for a few hours before doing a final bit of highlighting with model colour basic skin tone for Tom, once again dry brushing his raised facial features, and for Jessie I used a German camouflage pale brown for the same effect. The pale brown was also dry brushed onto Tom's hair to create some highlights and variation as well. With these highlights in the wash done, I sealed everything in with several thin coats of Vallejo water-based matte varnish using my airbrush to build up a protective layer, and then I sat the figures aside for 12 hours to let the varnish cure. I felt like their jackets still looked really dull, so I applied a heavily diluted coat of Vallejo model colour saddle brown onto them to add a subtle redness to the leather, and once that had dried, I then added some heavy highlights to simulate light and some wear on their jackets by dry brushing white and German pale camouflage brown mixed together. As a final touch, I then brush painted some water-based gloss varnish onto their jackets, goggles and gloves to give them a shinier appearance. This worked really well on the goggles, but maybe a satin varnish would have been better on the jackets. Finally, I removed the figures from the balsa and glued the standing figures to some clear plastic, which I had spare from my vacuforming. And with that, my devotion builds Corsairs and figures were finally completed. And here you can see the finished result. So the Revell Corsair definitely has some shortcomings, many of which come from sharing the tooling with their earlier Dash 1A release, and this leads to issues like an inaccurate cockpit, the missing step in the right flap, and the incorrectly shaped windscreen area for the Dash 4. On top of that, there was a fair bit of flashing to clean up, and some areas, especially the cowling and fuselage, needed quite a bit of persuading to fit properly. Because of that, I probably wouldn't recommend this kit for a beginner or anyone who's after a quick and stress-free build. There are also some subtle inaccuracies like slightly oversized exhausts, which are fairly easy to fix, and I'm sure I've missed a few others, so if you're a Corsair expert, feel free to point some of them out in the comments. The included armament is a bit limited with just 2 drop tanks and 2 bombs, which I think's a bit disappointing considering the Dash 4's reputation, especially in Korea, as a real bomb and rocket truck. That said, the kit's single scheme represents a training unit, so it's not entirely out of place. Personally, I'm glad though that I designed and printed my own cockpit and rockets to bring it up an extra notch. In terms of these 2 builds, I'm especially happy with how the cockpits turned out, and I really hope others enjoy using it as much as I did if they download it. I'm so glad I can create figures now to make up for modern kits' tendencies to leave them out, and they really add a lot of life to these aircraft, so that's something I'll definitely be doing more in future builds. They fit quite nicely into the cockpit since they were designed around it, although it's definitely easier to install them before closing up the fuselage halves rather than after. This kit was my first attempt at airbrushing a late World War II style glossy sea blue finish, so I'm pretty happy with the results, but I'd love any tips to improve for future builds, especially with my McDonnell Banshee, Grumman Panther and some more Corsair builds coming up. The weathering is probably a bit on the subtle side for a Korean War Corsair, particularly for aircraft like White 205, which, according to Pacific Rex, was actually built in the June of 1945, just barely missing combat in World War II when it arrived at its first post with VF-19 in September. Both Corsairs had likely seen a fair amount of service by the time of the Korean War, although on the other hand, they would have also been overhauled several times and repainted. Honestly, I quite like the cleaner, slightly shiny look for both of these aircraft, though the Vallejo glossy blue and gloss coat came out a bit duller than I actually expected they would. My custom decals from Laser Shark Designs performed really well, so I'll definitely be printing with them again in the future. In hindsight though, I should have designed a white backing layer to make the red on the roundels pop more, and also trimmed more of the carrier film away, but those are lessons I'll definitely apply in future builds. The Revell F4U-4 Corsair is a decent kit, but it's definitely not the best Corsair around. It takes some extra work to get the most out of it, though at the moment it seems to be one of the few relatively modern options for the later variants of Corsair. The Italeri kit is another option which I'd really love to pick up and have a look at some point, and compare to this one in a future video. It would be great to see a company like Tamiya or even Hobby Boss release a more refined and accurate Dash 4, but for now, this kit still produces a solid result, and I'd be open to building it again at some point in the future. Thank you very much for watching this video. I do hope you enjoyed it and got something out of it. If you did, please be sure to leave a like, and also subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future builds. For both of these aircraft, I was doing a lot of things for the first time, so if you have any advice you want to share with me and also any other modelers, please feel free to leave it down in the comments below. A massive shout out to my wonderful patrons for helping me to fund not only buying these kits, but also all of the products I use to make them, and the time I spend working on these videos. So without you guys, it wouldn't be possible to keep this up, so I really appreciate it. Later in this week, I'll be releasing part 2 of my LVT4 Amtrak build from the Airfix 176 scale Buffalo kit, so make sure you don't miss that one. And towards the end of the week, I also plan to have my 3,000 subscriber Q&A / future of the channel video out, where I'll be talking about my plans for the coming months and some of the larger projects I've been working on behind the scenes, as well as answering a couple of your questions. That's it for now, but until the next video, as always, take care and model on.